At the turn of the 20th century, the United States was a country where millions of Europeans immigrated to over the course of a few decades. So many new people in a completely unfamiliar place, just a promise of a better life. A long, dark path of hardship, but there's a light at the end of that path, and that light is Jane Addams and her Hull House. During the late 1800s, Jane Addams ventured into uncharted territory of the settlement house movement in America. Her Hull House crossed a frontier in assisting immigrants and helping them assimilate into American society. Addams's vision spread throughout the country and influenced similar systems for decades. A settlement house in the United States was a new idea, something unfamiliar that had never been done before, nonetheless by a woman. A site that encouraged culture and helped otherwise feared foreigners adjust to life in America. A site that nourished life's true meaning. A site that radiated light while entrapped in the stage and slums of Chicago. Who is Jane Addams? She was the founder of Hull House, a pioneer for women's rights, but at one point she was just a child. Laura Jane Addams was born the youngest of 9 children to John H. Addams and Sarah Weber on September 6, 1860. John H. Addams was a former mill owner turned politician who served in the Illinois Senate for 9 terms. He held Quaker values and persistently encouraged Jane to act upon and follow public affairs. When Jane was just 8 years old, she declared, "When I'm a grown-up lady, I'm going to buy a great big house. I don't want it to be near other big ones. Instead, next to poor people, so the kids can play in my yard." Jane's mother, on the other hand, passed away due to childbirth and left her with lasting conditions that held her back later in life. Jane Addams graduated top of her class from Rockford Seminary and joined a medical school in Chicago. She unfortunately had to drop out due to her health, and instead traveled the world with a friend from school named Ellen Gates Starr. It was in her travels to England and the surrounding areas that she stumbled across Tony B. Hall and found her life's true calling. The house settlement movement in the United States was derived from the harsh reality where many families would be forced to live in contaminated and treacherous neighborhoods and housing units. In 1884, a new idea was brought into the mix by a man in England. That idea was a place called Tony B. Hall. It was the first of its kind, that kind being a settlement house. A settlement house was a place where workers could settle and rest easily. Settlement houses were necessary for London because of the urbanization, industrialization, and immigration that happened within its city limits. Canon Samuel Bonnet, the founder and lead brain behind Tony B. Hall, promoted 3 main principles, those being that everyone had the capacity to grow and enjoy luxury, including people who had less, such as the working poor and immigrants, that evolutionary change would always trump revolutionary change, and that nations and neighborhoods were dependent on communication through the classes. Reformers also saw human life as precious, and that if necessities such as public baths, citizenships, and playgrounds had worked in more fortunate neighborhoods, then it should apply to their settlement neighborhoods as well. These ideals were brought back from England to the United States, and thus began the house settlement movement. The Hall Mansion in the near west side of Chicago was built by Charles Hull in 1855. At that time, the number of immigrants was under a quarter of the population of Chicago. He chose that particular spot because of the lack of neighbors, but as Chicago industrialized, the neighborhood grew to become a hotspot for immigrants. An influx of people were moving to Chicago because of meatpacking, steel, and clothing industry work opportunities. Between 1855 and 1866, the percentage of immigrants in Chicago doubled to 50%. In the near west side, there were roughly 50,000 Italian, German, Irish, Greek, Russian, and Polish immigrants. Due to cholera and the loss of his family in the late 1970s, Hull sold his home to a boarding house, which was then rented to Jane Addams starting in 1889. Jane Addams wanted Hull House to not only be a place to help people enjoy the small luxuries in life, she also wanted Hull House to be a movement that helped to improve the living and working conditions for people of the working class. Jane Addams frequently expressed that Hull House is not a charity. The house originally opened for art tours and book talks for the working class. A need for a daycare program was expressed, and Hull House expanded from there. Hull House started as a simple way for educated middle-class women to share their knowledge of the arts, literature, and basic life skills. And though it started as such, a bigger problem in the neighborhood was revealed. That was the need for a daycare center. As time progressed, Hull House made additions to their original foundation based on the needs of the people in the area. The main idea of Hull House was that the residents, or workers, instead of asking, "What can I do for you?" could instead ask, "What can we do together as equals?" The staff of Hull House were called residents because they paid rent and contributed to activities just like everyone else. Think, these immigrants fled from their homes to start a new life in the American dream, only to be met with either homelessness or wretched living and working conditions. Their American dream was just that, a dream. But Hull House captured that dream and made it into their reality. Jane Addams and the rest of the staff encouraged and helped to facilitate ways for immigrants to celebrate their national customs and personal traditions, thus encouraged them to become more familiar. Hull House offered a wide array of other services for either extremely cheap or completely free, such as a pool, a reading room, music schooling, an art gallery, a theater, dorms, a pool, legal aid, and an employment office. Another thing that was made available to visitors of Hull House was a labor museum, where first-generation immigrants could restore their dignity within their skills and culture and present it to the younger generation. In the museum, there were 6 departments: bookbinding, woods, textiles, grains, metals, and pottery. This museum made immigrants feel more so at home. Hull House helped to facilitate a study called Hull House Maps and Papers, which exhibited poverty in Chicago through different immigrant and ethnic groups and helped legislators understand how to combat it. The study helped to prove that although Hull House wasn't directly about poverty, it still had tremendous positive effects on it. These small luxuries provided a more fluid assimilation for immigrants into American society and provided a sense of normalcy. This was fundamental because immigrants made up over 51% of Chicago's entire population. Visitors of Hull House, as well as Jane Addams, were never directly pictured on the streets of Chicago because they were contently barricaded in the safe haven that was Hull House. Although Hull House was a majorly positive thing, some, usually upper-class people, found it too radical and too bizarre, especially after Jane Addams published her book, 20 Years at Hull House. Some thought that Hull House couldn't stand by itself, and that the path it was taking was unpleasant. Amongst the negative, many saw Jane Addams as a modern-day social reformer and a good omen for the future. W.T. Whitaker remarked that, "There is hope for the new social democracy when I reflect on Hull House." As for immigrants, they saw Hull House as a symbol of hope, and it restored their dignity. After its creation in 1889, Jane Addams stayed on as a resident and helped to care for the activities. From 1900 to 1915, over 15 million immigrants poured into the United States. Hull House supported over 4,000 immigrants from around the world into a new life in the United States each year. Many residents at Hull House, although not trained professionals, went on to create and spearhead the entire social work occupation. Florence Kelley, Alice Hamilton, and Julia Lathrop all have something in common. Apart from being pioneers in their respective professions, they all gained their work and world experience by working at Hull House. Some residents of Hull House proceeded to establish child labor laws, juvenile courts, and trade unions in Chicago. At a time when immigrants were feared, Hull House helped soften the public eye's opinion about them. It showed immigrants that they are not monsters and that they wouldn't always be regarded as such. It provided assurance that they wouldn't always be foreigners, and it gave otherwise silenced women a platform and a voice to do right in the world. Although the majority of Hull House shut down in 2012, it still leaves behind a massive footprint. Hull House inspired hundreds of settlement houses just like it to sprout up around the country, and provided home and luxury to immigrants for tens of years to come, and now provides a free museum for all to enjoy. Jane Addams and Hull House. Hull House, fostering a dream of dignity.